And the paper he'll be giving is entitled Utopian Futurism in the Music Theory of Yvonne Wyschnegradsky.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for being with me over Zoom. I sure wish I could be in Italy. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Around the turn of the 20th century, Russian music theory assumed the lofty task of putting music on a secure scientific footing. As many have noted, Russia's new theoretical enterprise responded to an influx of translated Western treatises by figures such as Hugo Riemann and François-Joseph Fétis, spurring new investigations into acoustics and grand theoretical systems. But few historians have considered Russian music theory's parallel engagement with the international artistic movement of futurism, practiced not only by polemicists in Italy and France, but also by radical painters, poets, and composers in Russia. In English language histories of Russian music theory, futurist ideas are often portrayed as a pseudoscientific passing fashion, eclipsed by the better known contributions of Sergei Taneyev, Boleslav Yavorsky, and Boris Asafiev. And in studies of Russian futurism, futurist music theory tends to be sidelined in favor of specific musical works by composers such as Alexander Mosolov and Nikolai Roslovitz. In general, Russian futurist music theory has proven an elusive historical category, not only because of its suppression in Stalinist Russia, but also, as Richard Taruskin has shown, because those émigrés who continued the Russian futurist project abroad found little sympathy or understanding. Those Russian émigrés who could neither assimilate nor go home, Taruskin notes, quite literally disappeared. In this paper, I'll examine Russian futurist music theory through the writings of Ivan Vishnugradsky, a composer-theorist who left Petrograd for Paris in 1920. Vishnugradsky's writings underscore the importance of utopian futurism, both to the development of Russian music theory and to the diversification of musical thought in the early 20th century. As much as Vishnugradsky's ideas engage with those of Fétis and Riemann, as received and transformed by figures such as Taneyev, they also expand on Russian futurist notions of ultrachromaticism. At another level, Vishnugradsky's writings dramatize a direct encounter with contemporaneous theories in Western and Central Europe. After 1920, Vishnugradsky started to position his ideas as alternatives to those of Schoenberg, decentering the Second Viennese School's claim to musical modernity. By looking into Vishnugradsky's neglected body of theory, I argue, historians can get closer to the unique legacy of Russian futurist music theory, to its initial utopian promise in the 1910s and 20s, and to its subsequent elaboration at home and abroad. The intellectual world in which the young Vishnugradsky found himself in 1910's St. Petersburg must have been dizzying. After brief stints in philosophy and law, Vishnugradsky began studying at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he fell in love with the music of Scriabin, attended futurist conferences, became involved in revolutionary socialism, and, perhaps most importantly, took up ideas in music theory that were to become his lifelong project. The state of music theory that Vishnugradsky would have encountered in St. Petersburg has been described by historians such as Ellen Carpenter and Philip Ewell. In the late 19th century, a St. Petersburg school of music theory had formed around the harmonic functionalism of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who had personally taught nearly all of Vishnugradsky's professors. And by the early 20th century, a new kind of speculative theory was taking hold across Russia, headed in large part by Rimsky-Korsakov's star pupil, Sergei Taneyev. Taneyev saw fit not just to teach his original theory of movable counterpoint, but also to bolster his ideas by appealing to the grand historical notions of Fétis. Repeating Fétis's idea, Taneyev wrote in 1903, "I will say that the augmented fourth, that is the tritone, of which they were so scared in the strict counterpoint epoch, has been made the very basis of our harmonic system," end quote. Not wanting our harmonic system to change, Taneyev further appropriated Fétis's term omnitonic to describe the unchecked chromaticism he feared would spell the decline of tonal music and sensible counterpoint. Outside the walls of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, Taneyev's notion of omnitonality found more creative and even utopian meanings in the writings of two of his students, Arseny Evreimov and Leonid Sabaneyev, and it was these ideas the young Vishnugradsky fastened on. For Evreemov, omnitonality named both a triumphant historical ascendancy of equal temperament and some future microtonality, both of which were heralded by the innovations of Scriabin. In Sabanyeyev's writings, no less fixated on Scriabin, Evreemov's equal-tempered omnitonality represented a corruption of mathematical and scientific purity. For Sabanyeyev, Scriabin's innovations were explicable only by the overtone series, and so could point only toward a microtonal system in just intonation, which Sabanyeyev called ultrachromatic. As Evreemov's and Savanyeyev's ultrachromatic debates raged in the journal Contemporary Music, the term ultrachromaticism eventually proved more appealing than Fétis's imported term. Although Evreemov and Vyshnegradsky held fast to theories of equal-tempered microtonality, they dropped mention of omnitonality around 1920 and started characterizing their work as ultrachromatic. Beyond Scriabin worship, the conversation Vyshnegradsky joined about microtonality also bore the strong imprint of Russian futurism. As early as 1908, futurist artist Nikolai Kulbin came forth with a manifesto called Free Music, calling on musicians to embrace microtonality for its primal connection with human subjectivity. While Kulbin's manifesto proved vague in its propositions, much like Ferruccio Busoni's contemporaneous pamphlet in Italy, it stimulated a significant amount of interest. Aside from fueling Evreemov's and Sabanyeyev's debate, Kulbin's ideas also induced fellow futurist Mikhail Matyushin to author his own treatise on microtonality called Guide for New Gradations of Tone. Matyushin's treatise made a special impact on Vyshnegradsky when it was published, not only for the content of its theory, but for its association with the infamous futurist opera, Victory Over the Sun, which premiered in St. Petersburg in 1913. Alongside stage designs by Kazimir Malevich, a prologue by Klebnikov, a libretto by Khrushchev, Victory Over the Sun featured music by Matyushin himself, lending his theories greater cultural purchase. A successor to and outgrowth of Silver Age mysticism, Russian futurism produced experiments in music theory that sustained interest across Russia in the 1910s and 20s, especially in St. Petersburg. In 1923, Petrograd distinguished itself by its Circle of Quarter-Tone Music, founded by none other than Rimsky-Korsakov's grandson. And in 1927, research on ultrachromaticism was carried out at Leningrad's Russian State Institute for the History of the Arts, even after Sabanyeyev, one of its initial members, had emigrated. For all its perceived lack of rigor, futurist microtonality held out a utopian promise that captured the imaginations of many, and it set some emigres like Vishnugradsky on lifelong projects abroad. As Vyshnegradsky synthesized conversations about microtonality and revolutionary socialism in Petrograd, he sat down one day in 1918 to write a brief biographical sketch of one of his greatest musical heroes, Ludwig van Beethoven. Projecting his German counterpart against the horizon of the recent October Revolution, Vyshnegradsky mused about Beethoven's attitude toward Napoleon, describing Beethoven as a heroic democrat and proletarian composer. In the following paragraph, Vyshnegradsky segued breathlessly from politics to music theory. Quote, Beethoven is the first omnitonic composer. In him, 12-tone equal temperament becomes an irresistible power. From him, the tendency toward the quarter tone begins, end quote. As Dwight Warren Allen has observed, histories of music in Russia during the 20th century tended to share Vyshnegradsky's Marxist Hegelianism, his assumption that history had led teleologically to its present point in Russian politics and music. Many Russian music theorists carefully demarcated epochs or eras of music, such as Taneyev, who celebrated a strict counterpoint epoch, or Yavorsky, who cautioned that his music theory was not culture-specific, but era-specific. Vyshnegradsky joined his colleagues in assuming a unifying historical telos, taking a stand against the idea that different historical musics were merely accidents of time and culture, or in Vyshnegradsky's words, quote, cultural ethnographic phenomena, end quote. Instead, he wrote, quote, the music of a people or of a civilization make history only in the sense that they realize the historical destiny of music, end quote. To explain the logic of music's historical destiny, its present revolution, Vyshnegradsky presented an elaborate dialectical system, which for the sake of brevity, he sometimes began with the classical era. In the classical era, he thought, a grand historical thesis had presented itself in the form of tonality's hierarchical acoustic principle, its grounding in the overtone series, first theoretically explicated by Rameau. Quote, it is only Rameau who, in the 18th century, in his Traité, recognizes the acoustic phenomenon as an objective basis for music theory, end quote. After Rameau's intervention, a subsequent historical antithesis brought about the theory known as harmonic dualism, defended, quote, at the beginning of the 20th century by von Oettingen and Riemann. Finally, with the late music of Scriabin, a historical synthesis resolved harmonic dualism into an anti-hierarchical atonality, where all pitches were equally permitted. In an unpublished manuscript, Vyschnegradsky's dialectic is set forth under the heading Pluralité, Dualité, Unité. A tonal plurality is countered by a major-minor tonal dualism, which is then resolved by a monist atonality. As a theorist, Vyschnegradsky's task was to understand in what precisely Scriabin's atonal historical synthesis consisted, and to what broader theoretical system it pointed, just as Rameau and Riemann had done for previous epochs. First, though, Vyschnegradsky needed to explain why his system and its indebtedness to Scriabin's work should take precedent over competing systems. As Vyschnegradsky began reading and writing French language works in his new home of Paris, he realized that his theory would have to contend with that of Schoenberg, whose influence was growing in Central and Western Europe. In Vyschnegradsky's sprawling 1949 article, L'énigme de la musique moderne, he offers his fullest critique of Schoenberg's theory. Most glaringly, he argues, ideas such as Schoenberg's 12-tone method present only arbitrary or artificial systems of composing with no, quote, objective basis, end quote. And when Schoenberg's theory does try to ground his compositional system, it fails to cohere. At one moment, Schoenberg appeals to the acoustic hierarchies of the overtone series, a decidedly retrogressive Vermelian appeal, while at another, he contradicts himself by asserting the dodecaphonic equality of pitches. Modern music needs an ambitious explanation, Vyschnegradsky argued, totally unmoored from tonality, not only to justify the modern music that had already been written, but to bring the future of music into the present. Schoenberg's ideas were too conservative. At the center of Vyschnegradsky's theory lay a concept of musical space. Not to be confused with Schoenberg's compositional notion of the same name, Vyschnegradsky's theory of musical space took again a long historical view, attempting to determine on what general assumptions, on what unconscious axioms modern music had come to rest. For Vyschnegradsky, musical space had always served as a mental arena on which pitches could be thought near or far from one another, related or unrelated, and this imaginary space was determined for listeners by the reigning consciousness of their particular epoch. To classical consciousness, musical space had assumed a diatonic pitch hierarchy, a limited and strictly defined system of attractive and repellent relationships by what we would have called tonal gravity. Eventually, Vyschnegradsky thought, this musical space of classical consciousness came under impossible pressure with the rise of equal temperament, which eroded any strict delineation of acoustical hierarchy. To modern consciousness, musical space began to appear not as a closed hierarchy of intervals against an empty background, but as a non-hierarchical plenitude, a continuous stream of pitches filling musical space from its highest to its lowest reaches. My keynote is frozen. One second. Okay, there we go. Vyschnegradsky's vision for modern musical space spans 7 octaves, from A0 to A7, occupying what he takes to be the full range of normal human hearing and musical practice. To represent a smooth atonal continuum, this 7-octave range is sketched as a repeating series of tritones, with accidentals replaced by tonally neutral crossed note heads, following the notational convention of Vyschnegradsky's fellow émigré, Nikolai Obukov. Another division of the same musical space is suggested in a line at the top of the example. If all 7 octaves are divided evenly into 12th tones, which for Vishnugradsky approached the human threshold for interval discrimination. A maximally dense collection of 505 discrete pitches results, forming an audibly seamless continuum. But Vishnugradsky's modern musical space can be divided in virtually any manner. Its only governing principles are those of intervallic regularity, symmetry, and equilibrium, designed expressly to negate tonal assumptions of hierarchy and key center. Vishnugradsky's vision of modern musical space synthesizes several influences. As many have noted, its valorization of a smooth, seamless pitch continuum takes inspiration from notions of continuous experience in Henri Bergson's thought, which Vishnugradsky was exposed to at a futurist conference in 1918. His theory has also been linked to Russian discussions of non-Euclidean geometry and to the philosophical writings of figures like P.D. Uspensky, who fueled Russian futurist notions of a spatio-temporal fourth dimension. Vishnugradsky's historical conception of musical space also clearly invokes Hegel and Marx, though it is likely more accurate to say that it was influenced by the Russian religious cosmists who reinterpreted these philosophers, such as Vladimir Solovyov and Pavel Florensky, popular among Russian symbolists and the Scriabin circle. As often as Vishnugradsky discusses modern consciousness in his early writings, for instance, he also discusses a utopian modern cosmos. And, echoing the 19th century cosmist Nikolai Fedorov, the common task of its achievement by humanity. Once he emigrated, Vishnugradsky's Russian citizenship was revoked, and he faced difficulties realizing his projects in Paris. While he spoke good French, he had learned the language from a childhood governess, and while he enjoyed some interaction with Messiaen, Boulez, and Xenakis, he was mostly marginalized and even thought insane by his Western European peers. For the most part, Vishnugradsky's theories spread only after his death, finding wider publication in France in the 1990s and 2000s, and influencing quite a bit, actually, contemporary composers such as Georg Friedrich Haas. For historians, I have argued, Vishnugradsky's writings hold out the special value of shedding new light on the development of Russian futurist music theory in the early 20th century. His writings also present a remarkably unique vision of so-called modern music, removed in many respects from ideas theorists in the West tend to be familiar with, such as those of Schoenberg and his disciples. In line with the latter point, I want to conclude my presentation by lingering over Vishnugradsky's surviving analysis of Anton Vabran's Variations, Opus 27, Second Movement, now a staple of the post-tonal analytical repertoire in America. Although Vishnugradsky criticized the ideas of the Second Viennese School, he admired their music, and he thought his competing theory could explain its most fundamental principles. Only 11 measures long, Vishnugradsky's analysis presents Vabran's original score in a lower staff, labeled Original, and a spatial reduction in an upper staff, labeled Structure Spatiale. His first spatial reduction collects together the pitches from the pickup to measure 1, a G sharp, 2 A's, and a B flat, holding them to their original registers in a vertical stack. Starting from Vabran's low G sharp, a minimally displaced octave of 13 semitones separates each remaining pitch in the structure, earning it the label Régime 13, espace non-octavant, non-octavating space, third 3G. For measure G4 and 5, a second spatial structure collects all 8 of Vabran's distinct pitches, excluding grace notes. The distance between its pitches alternates between 5 and 6 semitones, so that 11 semitones separate each pitch from the pitch 2 notes above it. Its label, Régime 11, Structure Binaire, describes a binary structure that repeats at the near octave interval of 11 semitones rather than 13. Over Vishnugradsky's 12-measure analysis, 5 distinct 11 or 13 semitone structures are identified, their precise registral positions in Vishnugradsky's total musical space cataloged in parentheses below the upper staves. Of course, much is left out in Vishnugradsky's analysis. Inversionally related sets make no appearance, and neither do the row permutations Vabran consigns entirely to the pianist's separate hands. But for Vishnugradsky, in all likelihood, post-tonal theory's standard observations would deal only in shallow compositional devices. Refusing to hear in terms of tone rows, set classes, or even George Pearl's abstracted interval cycles, Vishnugradsky's analysis attends instead to the precise registers of Vabran's pitches and notices their structures of spatial equilibrium. According to the spatial principle of modern consciousness, he tells us, quote, a sound transposed to one or more octaves is no longer the same sound, because it occupies another point in space, end quote. With his brief analysis then, Vishnugradsky unfolds Vabran's music within his own theory, within his own view of history's teleological movement. Hearing Vabran's piece through Vishnugradsky's ears, one gets to hear the piece otherwise, from a cultural and geographical perspective not often acknowledged in Western histories of music theory. At the same time, one gets to hear an alternative future, an ambitious attempt to theorize a post-tonal utopia. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that incredibly thought-provoking paper. We have time for questions. Right. Yes, please, Maria.
Thank you, it's a fascinating paper. I was really struck by the idea of sort of liberating pitch. How much did you know about the work of, for example, the futurism of Arthur Luria, when he's liberating not pitch, but rhythm? So he's got all these graphic scores that are appearing decades before their time. So all these systems that are not juxtaposed properly and no bar lines, just very visual about it.
Yeah, well, he would be, I guess, another primary example of an emigre who's important to the futurist movement. And Taruskin has written more about him. It was also very important historically for the reception of Italian futurism in Russia, for the sort of visit of Marinetti there. Yeah, I mean, that could be a parallel sort of liberation. I mean, Vishnugradsky is, as you say, very focused on pitch. This is kind of a peculiarity, I guess, of his theory. Although, you know, look more into maybe how they interacted, the two of them, if they did to any great extent when they were both in Russia, because there is a bit of a focus on rhythm in Vishnugradsky's early Russian writings, which I don't know Russian well enough yet to read, but perhaps there's some crossover there. And yeah, maybe I should look more into Luria's work. Thanks.
Do you think it's, sorry, it's just my curiosity. Do you think it's more because Vyschnegradsky comes from a more literary milieu and Luria from a more painterly background?
Yeah.
Or actually is this just like two different clans that gravitate towards two different ideas and never really combine?
Yeah, I like your idea actually of their backgrounds being different. It is also the case in Italian futurism that these painters, like Rossolo was a painter, did a lot of things with timbre and rhythm. And Vyschnegradsky, I mean, his dad was important to the music scene in St. Petersburg, but really music was not what his parents expected him to do. And he was part of a pretty wealthy and well-connected family. And he started out by studying philosophy and law because that was sort of what it was expected of him. Yeah.
Right, any other questions? Yes, please, William Hussey.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting paper. Just as a side thing on the Vabran analysis, do you know why he chose to leave out the grace notes?
You're right. I think that it didn't quite work with his theory, frankly. I think that was it's a banal reason. It just worked out that way. Yeah. I think if I had to look again at the example, but I think if you include the grace notes, it's just not perfectly symmetrical.
So a case of when the theory doesn't fit the facts, change the facts then.
Yeah, recurring theme over the history of music theory for sure.
Okay, other questions? We have about 5 minutes. Yes, Maria again.
Sorry, how much of his work did filter back into, for example, the Soviet Union?
Right. It took a while, actually. It was probably, I think, in the 1990s when, what's his name now? A major theorist today in Russia took his works, I mean, took his compositions more seriously than his theory, frankly. Basically thought that Vishnugradsky stood for a kind of example of a 12-tone, or like he has this Russian word, 12-toneness, to describe various kind of then forgotten composers like Vishnugradsky and Nabokov, etc., who are working with 12 tones in a kind of way that you could think about in relation to Schoenberg, to kind of challenge the supremacy of Schoenberg historically, but compositionally. I guess, you know, it's it's just kind of frustrating for me that Vishnugradsky's theory is so ignored, because he worked so hard on this really like ambitious, elaborate system and wrote so much about it. And it's I find it fascinating.
I'm just thinking in terms of people like Volkonsky and whether their attitude to tonality somehow intersected with any of this thinking, or if that, again, that's just another parallel offshoot, and what we're seeing is just lots of parallel offshoots that tend to deal with similar things, but actually all reverberate around the same centers.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there really are a lot of parallel offshoots. One actually interesting example of this is, so Abukov, I didn't really go into this in my paper, but the other emigre from whom Vishnugradsky takes this absolute notation of cross note heads, is obsessed with this new notation system, and always like claims to have invented it in 1915. And but he's been kind of ignored in favor of, I think, a Ukrainian, I forget his name now, but a Ukrainian composer and music theorist who invented like an almost identical notational system around the same time. But all the scholars seem to suggest like there's no evidence that they ever interacted with each other. So to your point, I think there's just all these parallel, like suspiciously similar and streams going on that are nonetheless kind of independent of each other.
Okay, any last minute questions? We have another minute or so.